here.
Got it.
Okay, I think we are just about good to go here. We'll give it one more second. Okay. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Doug Larkin. I am the program chair and incoming, it's not president, what is it? The AERA, I guess it's AERA SIG chair for next year. I'm really delighted to be sharing this book chat with everyone here. And before we go ahead and introduce him, I just want to give a couple updates on our upcoming SIG activities. And let me hit the share screen here. Okay. Tonight we'll be talking about the book Why We Teach Science and Why We Should with the author John Rudolph. Coming up next month, we have Edna Tan and Angela Calabrese-Spartan talking about their book, Teaching Towards Rightful Presence in Middle School STEM. In March, we have Antar Tichivakunda with Black Campus Life, world's Black students make at a historically white institution, and that talk will have an engineering focus. And then on April 30th, we'll be talking about the book Dialogic Collaborative Action Research in Science Education. And there's about 4 authors on there. My font isn't big enough to read, but Alan Feldman is and his colleagues will be here. All 4 of them will be here for that one. And then we'll have Maria Ong in May and Daniel Morales-Doyle in June. And that'll be it for this year, and we'll start them up again in September. And if you want to, you can go to, I'll put this link in the chat, the AERA SIG page for meetings and other events to register for all of those upcoming talks. We also have a really fun announcement coming up at AERA in Philadelphia at the annual conference. We have rented out a museum for our reception. So I hope all of you are able to join us at the Science History Institute, which is a fantastic institution for a number of reasons. They do really great work. About 10 years ago, it was called the Chemical Heritage Museum, and they've sort of rebranded and taken on a new mission. It's a fantastic space, and we'll be there from 5 to 7 p.m. on the Friday night at AERA. And we've sent a reminder out to everyone, an announcement in your email, but please feel free to share and bring guests and or future members of the SIG to that event. Oh, that's the inside. And just to show you, it's not terribly far from where the convention center is. It's a little bit more towards the Delaware River side of Philadelphia. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing here. So Dr. John Rudolph is a professor. He's a Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor in the Department of Curriculum Instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has affiliate appointments in the Department of Educational Policy Studies and the Robert and Jean Holtz Center for Science and Technology Studies. He's the past editor-chief of the Wiley & Sons journal Science Education. And prior to his faculty appointment, he taught physics, chemistry, and biology in middle schools and high schools across Wisconsin. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. John Rudolph to talk about his book. Oh, you can't see it there. Why Teach Science, Why We Should. That's what I get for having a Zoom background. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Doug. It's great to be here, and this seems like a lot of fun. I love these book chats. Seem great.
Fantastic. Well, we're really glad to have you. Just a reminder to everyone who's in attendance, this is an interactive session, so I'm going to get the ball rolling with a couple of questions to John about the book and the argument he makes in the book. And then if you have a question, you can either do the hand raise within Zoom there, or if you prefer to type the question in the chat, and then you can read it out to John if you prefer. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it out for you if you're not in a place where you can turn your microphone or camera on. So, John, I'd like to start by asking if you could give a brief description of your book for anybody who hasn't read it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is great. I love Doug promised me this is going to be a low stakes, informal conversation. So that's what I'm looking forward to. I've given plenty of talks about the book, and this is a nice chance just to really talk informally about what I've tried to accomplish and some of the arguments. And so as the title, excuse me, of the book kind of sets the stage. It's why we teach science and why we should. So the the book is arguments broken into three parts, and the first part is sort of this why we teach science part of it. It's in the book I call it part one, what we say, and I lay out the various arguments that people typically make for science education, and and you've seen these in various publications and articles of the reasons for teaching science, and I've sort of distilled them down to four. The first being science education for cultural appreciation is one of the arguments or justifications. Another common one is science education for better thinking. This is the critical thinking skills, analytical thinking that we think learning about science helps students with. Science education for utility, the things we teach, the science content we teach is useful to students either for in their daily personal lives or for the country as a whole, the sort of workforce training issues, national security, things like that. And then the last being science education for democratic decision making. And so the first chapter of the book, it's a long chapter, lays out sort of the historical emergence of these justifications for why we teach science. And that gives a nice overview, I think, of those things and those arguments. And then I shift in part two. This section I call, so the first part is what we say, and then the second part is what we do. What do classrooms look like? When we try to imagine the ideal science classroom, what does that consist of? And if you ask science teachers, concerned parents, school board members, folks like this, they'll say it's about learning key disciplinary core ideas, having students learn how to solve canonical science textbook problems, solid hands-on work in the laboratory. And if you're looking at a program as a whole, typically really good science programs have AP science course offerings, biotech course offerings, things with sort of an engineering focus in line with this argument that we want to prepare a technically trained workforce. And these are all hallmarks of what many would consider to be high quality science education. And you see this in sort of the NGSS standards documents in particular. And what I try to look at then in this book is, does that vision of what we think a high quality science education is, does it accomplish these things we say science education aims to achieve? And so then I look empirically at the research and try to examine whether the research supports the claims. Does that kind of science education result in critical thinking skills, cultural appreciation, personal utility, democratic decision making? And it turns out that it really doesn't. That what I call in some other places these myths of science education. So one, the main driving force, especially among policymakers, is that science education is about preparing students for science-related careers, filling the STEM pipeline. And the interesting thing is when you look at the numbers, and in chapter two, or actually chapter three, if you look at the numbers, it's only a very small fraction of students who go through a science education program, go into a higher education setting, earn a degree in a science-related field. And this, I include everything from people who are going to be dental hygienists, nurses, engineers, any kind of health-related field, and then end up working in one of these fields. If you look at the sort of an incoming freshman class in high school, and those that end up in any kind of 2-year or 4-year degree working in a science-related profession, it's 4%, or I'm sorry, it's not 4, it's 7% of that student population. So you've got 93% of the students of incoming high school freshmen who don't end up in those career sorts of opportunities. And so the question I raise is, well, what kind of science education, what is it doing for them? And so setting aside that technical training argument, then I look at this question of, well, what is it then better thinking skills? Is it personal utility? And it turns out the research shows that this content focused kind of science education that we're teaching in schools, even in the best schools, doesn't really accomplish those things. When you look at how people use science in their daily lives, they don't usually rely, like if they have a you get a stain in a pair of pants or something like that. People don't usually think back to their high school science chemistry class to find out how to get that out. They're going to look it up on YouTube or ask a friend or a parent. And for larger socio-scientific issues, for example, people typically rely on their social networks. They don't rely on science content knowledge. And the research in socio-scientific thinking shows that people make decisions not based on their content knowledge, but rather based on things like their ethical position, morality, and social context that they're in. And so it looks at these sort of myths. And so what I find is that it doesn't really produce these better thinking skills. It doesn't have this content focused approach, doesn't have effective payouts for personal utility or dealing with socio-scientific issues. And the question then is, well, what should it do? What should science education do? And that's the third part of the book. That's what we need. And based on recent trends that we see, I argue that the primary goal of this general education in science should be science education for building public trust. And in that, I think that we need a shift from thinking about teaching science as just a bunch of content knowledge to teaching how scientists and how the scientific establishment develops understandings of the natural world and what that institutional context looks like. And I go into that in the book. And I don't have a lot of like very specific answers of how to get there. But what I do end with is that the current focus, this very content focused approach, isn't getting us what we think it's getting us. And so that's the examination. And I try to end up with a sort of a practical philosophy of science education that I lay out in the book.
Thanks. I mean, that, I think that I just reread the book this week in preparation for this, and I think you just walked me through like every one of the chapters, and I appreciate that. That's a very apt summary. There's a couple things. I mean, you have this very provocative title for chapter 4, right? The failure of scientific literacy. And I think that, I mean, you make a really strong argument as to like that notion of scientific literacy isn't really helpful or doesn't, I think, what do you say? You say it serves no useful purpose. And I was thinking about, so I've been doing some work in science teacher retention. And one of the things I noticed is the concept of job satisfaction. Like they talk about that the same way that you talk about scientific literacy. Like, yeah, it's this vague concept, but it's really hard to measure and it doesn't really do anything for us. So let's figure out what we actually care about. Is it like that it's such a vague construct that it doesn't, like the notion of literacy still holds when we're talking about like reading and writing, but it seems like the modifier of science does something to it. Can you talk about that piece of it a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And I recently published this past summer an article on the real origin story of scientific literacy, which goes into this in much greater depth than JARST. And if you're interested, you could look that up. But basically, what I argue is scientific literacy is this catchphrase or slogan that people are easy to agree with. Of course, we want people to be scientifically literate, but those that end up writing about it, or when you get down to the question of, well, what does that mean? There's always a requirement to, well, let's define that more specifically. And Benjamin Shen, a physicist from Penn back in the 1970s, the first sort of detailed argument he made was to say, well, there's different kinds of scientific literacy. There's civic science literacy. There's cultural scientific literacy. There's, I forgot the third one, but there were three essentially. It was a utilitarian version of scientific literacy. And so in the end, if you have to further define it, then why not just get rid of the concept altogether? I mean, let's just say, what do we want to accomplish? Do we want people to understand science in a way that they're going to trust certain things, certain pronouncements that, say, the IPCC makes, that representatives of CDC statements that they make, that they understand, well, I know enough about science to know that this is an authoritative source? Is that the kind of scientific literacy we want? Or is it a scientific literacy that's something else? In other words, just define precisely what it is. Just to say scientific literacy doesn't give you anything other than, oh, nobody disagrees with that. You know, it's like apple pie and democracy and those kinds of things.
I think in that last third of the book, I mean, you make a case for reconceptualizing what it means to teach science, right? Like in a way, this book is an argument for reconsidering like science as a school subject and what it means when we say we're teaching science. And you draw upon the analogy of like social studies being different from, say, the discipline of, you know, history or political science. Like we have social studies in the schools, and you don't necessarily say science studies in the school, but my brain went there thinking about like, okay, what would a science studies class, like will we have AP science studies, or, you know, like, I mean, you talk a lot about AP as, you know, serving this curricular function within US schools. But I wonder, like, I mean, would there be an AP science studies in a reconceptualized version, or is it something different?
Yeah, ideally, I think that'd be fantastic, right? I mean, so what we end up with these AP courses is just very focused content courses that oh, we need people to understand, you know, the basic ideas of chemistry or physics or biology, and then when you get into the biology, they need to know the phases of cell division or the steps in the Krebs cycle, and that ends up being the essence of, say, biology or the relevant content in chemistry or physics. But that doesn't really do anything for the students, right? They don't understand more about science. They just know a lot of science content. That in the methods class that I teach, I try to tell my students, you can get students to memorize this stuff and they'll pass the test, and then they're going to forget it. And it's not going to be anything they're going to actually use in their everyday life. And so I think there are more valuable things to learn about science. And maybe it's a science studies argument than it is just a science content focused approach.
Well, I mean, you know, I'll keep asking you questions, but we're starting to get them in the chat. So, Maureen, would you like to unmute and ask your question, or I can read it for you, your preference?
Here, I'll go ahead. I'm just wondering, because I hear this from the teachers I work with a lot, because there's a lot of end of course tests out there. There's a lot of those benchmark tests. There's a lot of quarterly tests. There's a lot of things that come down from a state level that teachers are required to teach that don't necessarily tax critical thinking, or even are even designed in a three-dimensional way. And they're pretty content focused. How do you suggest helping teachers negotiate those end of course tests but still instill this love of science and all of what you're talking about? Because I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what's the word you give those methods students?
Yeah, and I have these conversations with them all the time. And I think that the thing that I try to focus on is, so in the book I argue, let's go away from sort of this catalog of facts and content and all of that we, you know, all the standards. There's too many standards. Research has shown that. And look at more sort of the epistemology of science. How did we come to know these things? How did scientists come to understand the structure of DNA, or the various scientific theories that they've come up with? What's the evidence? What's the argument that they make? And who created that, and in what context, and where did this knowledge come from? And the point I try to make with them is that you're not going to teach these big ideas. You're going to be focusing on these big ideas. The theory of evolution through natural selection, the atomic theory, those kinds of things. And by looking at this richer context of where these ideas came from, you're still going to be talking about core scientific ideas. And these are going to prepare students to learn in a meaningful way the core science content that they may be tested on. But with respect to all the other tests and things that they take, there aren't really very many consequences for those, at least not in Wisconsin. I mean, science isn't really tested in any significant way so in other words, I tell them, if you teach science in a rich, meaningful way, so that the students are going to learn it not just at a superficial level, but at a deep level with understanding, then you're going to serve those students well, and the tests will turn out fine one way or another.
Thanks, Maureen. Suzanne Patzelt had a comment. I just had to share because of John's comment earlier that I literally did a science fair project testing the efficacy of Shout versus OxyClean. So those still exist.
Yeah.
Helen Meyer, would you like to ask your question? If I can ask people, just introduce yourself and where you're from. That's always great. Feel free to unmute, or I can read your question if you prefer.
So John, we crossed paths in Madison for maybe 20 minutes when you were on your way in and I was on my way out.
Yes.
I'm not sure I was on my way out. I might have been on my way overseas. So I'm in Cincinnati. And I guess my question is, like, so the science studies is in your book was pretty tilted towards high school and secondary.
Yeah.
I have grandkids now in 3rd and 4th grade science, and we are learning, are learning the structure of the atom and this sort of this repetitiveness. And so when do we start teaching science? When does science and understanding science have value, and how does that change over time?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that one of the things that we need to appreciate is that science education isn't static. Like, oh, it's always the same regardless of the developmental level of the student or anything like that. That different schools and institutions have different purposes, right? So when we talk about preparing for a scientific workforce, technical training, well, that's great for tech schools and majors at the college level, university level. That's where that should happen. I think at the high school level, it should focus on these more sort of a general education approach and appreciation of science and understanding science. At the younger grades, you're not going to get into deep epistemological questions or history of science necessarily, but that's where you can, I think, focus on getting students to just wonder about the natural world and to begin to ask questions like, what do I see and what do I know and how do I know that? And to talk with one another and to establish that science is a communal way of developing understanding. It's not just individuals learning and memorizing or filling out worksheets or coloring paper diagrams or things like that, but that they should be engaged with the natural world and collectively making sense of it as best they can at that level and getting them excited about the natural world. I think that's where that would come in. But yes, Helen, I saw your name and I thought, oh, I know her.
Thanks. Feel free to raise your hand or post questions in the chat. I got another one here, John, for you in the meantime.
Sure.
I mean, in chapter 7, you're talking about the issue of public trust. And I started thinking about, every once in a while I'll listen to these different podcasts, like Malcolm Gladwell's got one, and his like main theme over the last couple of years is this notion of the erosion of public authorities, right? Yeah, and he calls it like the referees are disappearing is the way that he frames that. And part of that has a, political and social aspect. But, part of it is just because the world is so big and full of facts, and figuring out what's true is challenging. What's the role of science education in that, in building that public trust again? I think in the book you talk about having an expert at the table, right, as part of that democratic decision making. But how are you thinking about that larger idea about that? How do we push back against the erosion of referees?
Yeah, I think that notion of public trust is really important, and I think that part of the reason we don't have that is that science always, or has, come to us as just sort of handed down as fact. And it's easy to be suspicious of someone saying, here's the fact that you should believe. And I think that if we shift some of the science education that we do with students toward understanding, well, where does that come from? Who created that? How is it created? And Naomi Oreskes has this great book that she published, I think, a few years back, based on a series of lectures, Why Trust Science, right? And yeah, there it is.
It's not showing.
Disappears in your background, yeah. But she goes through and explains that these are folks who are the ones that are working with the natural world intimately on a daily basis. They're doing it not individually. It's not just someone's brilliant idea, but that it goes through this vetting process through a community of practitioners that arrive at a consensus. And that consensus is not truth, but this is what we believe to be the case at the moment, based on what we know. And having students understand that process, and that those scientists are funded by government grants or private foundation grants, and that kind of knowledge is different than the science that's funded by ExxonMobil related to climate change, or by Philip Morris tobacco companies about the harms of cigarette smoke and its effect as a carcinogen. That it's like, that would make sense to them, that people funded by these companies with a vested interest we might want to question the conclusions they draw versus what science is. And science isn't infallible by any means, but understanding more about where it comes from, and the goal of disinterestedness, objectivity, in a collective sense, is something that's unique. And Harry Collins has written about this. And there's not an obvious thing that we do in the classroom to get there. That's the challenge of science education. But it's something that I think we should be moving in that direction. Certainly away from, let's just memorize the content in the textbook.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Ben, please introduce yourself and feel free to ask your question.
Hi, John. My name is Ben Lowell. I'm at NYU right now. And as a teacher educator, I was really interested to hear you to read some of the things you were talking about, and I really wanted to hear more about your implications for science teacher education for this, which I looked, and you dedicate maybe like 3 pages to implications for science teacher education, which I thought were really interesting. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, what do you see as potential implications for how we as science teacher educators can try to begin to shift some of the thinking around this. Particularly, I find that when I'm working with pre-service teachers, there's always this tension between what could be and what is, right? And that's something that they really feel as they're entering the profession. And so I think sometimes we can do a disservice to pre-service teachers by only teaching the what could be without letting them, helping them enter the world of what is. But at the same time, if we only focus on what is, then it limits our ability to think about what could be. So I just wonder if you I'd love to hear more of your thoughts and speak on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ben. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. I feel the tension that you feel. The students come in our program now, it's a master's program, so they come in with degrees already in the sciences, and they sit down and they feel like, well, I know my science. I'm a chemistry major, I'm a biochemistry major. And my goal is to get them to think differently about, and then they think, all right, my goal is to get the students excited and learn the content, right? And they're excited about it because they've been successful learning science content. And so, the things that we do are to get them to rethink what is science education for and about. And the whole book is sort of a culmination of my 20 years teaching the science methods course at Wisconsin and trying to think about what message do I want to get across. And you're right. In the end, there is only a few pages on that. And a lot of it is, we know what doesn't work. And by the end of December, at the end of the first semester, they do an intro methods course, and then in the spring they're doing an advanced methods course. At the end of the first semester, they do say things like, I just don't know what to do now. I feel like I don't know anything. And I'm like, okay, I know you're like frustrated, but there is a goal, and let's think about, there's not a script for how to get there, but we know there are these things that we'd like to achieve, and everyone's going to be able to do it differently, and there's not a right single answer to do that. But let's think intelligently about, just because what you thought you were going to do is easy doesn't mean you should just continue doing it, because the research shows that it doesn't accomplish the goals we think it does. So yeah, I don't, there are simple things that I try to get across, like, what does it mean to really understand something? Even just the content, there versus just memorizing content. And we go through all of that, and I don't, and in the end, I don't know that, I don't have a real answer for you.
No, I know there isn't an answer, right? That's what we're all working with together. One of the things I really appreciated about this book, right, is I feel like sometimes we're talking with pre-service teachers about better ways to engage students in understanding the natural world, but it ultimately is still, that technical training goal, right? Like, I think that it's, doing this, reading this helped me reflect on the conversations that I'm having with pre-service teachers, which is often things like, hey, if students talk, they understand science better, which is true and is a challenge, and is not actually getting at science for public trust, right? Like that's like a whole different, a whole different type of thing that we're thinking about. And so, and I think that's something that's particularly interesting, is like, how can we talk with pre-service teachers about building public trust in science, and also, still like, hey, maybe students should be the ones doing the most amount of talking in the classroom rather than the teacher.
Yeah, I agree. And I think part of that, and we don't want the notion of building public trust just to be, oh, you should trust scientists, right, in some kind of a didactic way. It's more of a, well, why should we believe this? Why do we think this to be the case? What is the evidence for it? And so getting at that as much as you possibly can, I think is always going to be positive. And having students engage in those kinds of sense-making activities themselves, where they come to a collective decision and a consensus based on evidence, and being able to make those arguments to one another in class, I think is also a positive way to sort of model that kind of thinking, learning outcomes.
Thanks for your question, Ben. And just a reminder to anybody who's just joined us, please feel free to put a question in the chat, or just raise your Zoom hand. I think we have our next question from Suzanne Patzelt. Suzanne, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, I'm just gonna read it directly from the chat, if that's okay. And it goes really hand in hand on kind of where the last question left off. But I asked, how do we build trust in the science community while at the same time acknowledge things that have gone very wrong in the science community and what has led to a lot of the mistrust that's not simply from a misunderstanding or being taught rote memorization, but more from actual, mistreatment by folks in the science community to particular groups of people, as well as like a lack of recognition of other ways of viewing scientific knowledge outside of maybe a Western colonialist perception of what science is.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great question. It's one that I've been asked quite a bit, and there's a balance between right. I'm not arguing in the book that we want anyone to have a blind trust in science, right? Science has been used for all kinds of nefarious purposes and harmful effects on individuals and groups of people over the years, and that's absolutely true. But that's true of almost any practice, right? So we talk about the law and legal thinking and legal processes, and that also has been manipulated and misused to the detriment of many people. So it's not, I think the negative aspects are just part of the human nature of it all, right? But science in a more philosophical, sort of a Deweyan sense, is simply relying on the evidence of our senses. And so places where that in an ideal epistemic community, Helen Longino uses that phrase, will result in the best knowledge that you can develop. And you see this in the examples of Naomi Oreskes' book that Doug pulled out on the Why We Trust Science. She has a number of vignettes of science gone awry, and all the instances. Those are really instructive for why certain historical episodes in science didn't resulted in harm. What went wrong, and it was because of science not collectively adhering to its sort of epistemic goals. And so I think that it's not science itself that is harmful. It's sort of this distortion of science that happens when humans, right, exert power over others. And so that needs to be fought anytime it happens, whether it's in science, whether it's in the law, whether it's in any various professions that exist. And I think that, and to your question of this balance between, we don't want blind trust in science, but lately the tendency has been the opposite, right? There's been so much cultivation of misinformation and distrust, where everyone thinks, the famous do your own research, right? Everyone can find anything on the internet. And so to understand that that's not how scientists do research, that the way scientists do research is very different, and that it's accorded a different status, sort of a epistemic status, epistemic authority in society for a reason. And that understanding those differences, how knowledge is generated and how people generate knowledge and collect knowledge and act on knowledge is part of what I would argue should be the work of science classrooms. So there's a great new book out by Sam Weinberg and some colleagues called Verified, which isn't about science in particular, but it's about how people access knowledge on the internet in particular, and how you go about finding what's reliable and what's not reliable. And he offers a lot of good recommendations, different strategies. And it's because people need to take on that role of gatekeeping that they didn't used to have to, that we used to have editors and it wasn't everyone, this just free for all out there where you can find anything and everything. And so it's a complex new world we're in. And I think it's people are trying to figure out what our next steps are. And this development of trust is something I see emerging in the literature more and more.
Thank you. And could I
Yeah,
make a response?
sure.
I think not slightly pushing back, but also you kind of addressed it towards the end. But, you know, when I'm in conversations with teacher candidates and current teachers teaching science, like I think the conversation also comes up is that even though it's gone through this vetted process, you know, we can argue that that process itself has been commandeered and has been authored by particular people of power. So to necessarily go through the typical, you know, this is a trusted science journal, but who has been given the privilege to publish in those journals for this many years, still kind of brings up some of these questions. And I think you started to address that at the end, but it's just a tough
Yeah,
topic.
exactly. Yeah, no, I appreciate you pushing back, because I certainly wouldn't presume to be the authoritative source of everything here, right? It's a collective discussion that we're having, and your point there that you're making about what that process is and who's involved in that process and who's excluded from that process, I think should be a focus of science education, that we should look at that, and that process and who's inside and who's outside, and in a perfect epistemic community, you have more and more people inside who represent the community that science is supposed to serve. And there's a part in the book where I go into that in much more detail. So thank you for that.
And John, I would be remiss if I didn't link this to your earlier work, right? Where you talk about the status of science coming out of World War II and what the scientists did with that with respect to education. And that being in tension with this, you know, the status of science and who gets to be in the room, and that, you know, that authority, it's that appeal to that authority that we're still feeling, you know, almost 75 years later.
Yeah, and actually the work that was done with the NSF curriculum reform projects that Doug's referring to coming out of World War II, those scientists were very much interested in what they called scientific literacy, which was not focus on scientific content, but an appreciation of what it means to do science. And this is where the whole notion of science as inquiry came from. But their version of that was understand and appreciate. It's very complicated, and it's not for the masses. Like, you just need to let us do our thing. And I think that the shift I would make is, we want people to understand what science is, but that there's a role for the public, and people have a voice, and it's not just the scientists who decide, that the public are the ones paying the bills and funding the science, that they should have a voice in what gets done and who it benefits.
Thanks. We have Maureen, do you want to read your question? Or shall I? Okay.
It's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay. But Helen asks, how do your method students take all this? what's their response to you know?
Yeah, I mean,
they're less certain about what they know about science.
They end up puzzled and sometimes distraught, or like, now I don't know anything. Yeah, I mean it, and I try to say there's no so what I try to get at in the book, and this is the goal, I think, is, let's think about, what do we really want to accomplish? What's the goal? Why do we teach science? Because some of them will just say, well, I know I can teach all this facts and stuff, and I'm good at it, and I like to explain things. And I try to ask them, like, well, what does that get you in the end? It doesn't really get us what we want to achieve. And so let's think more philosophically. What are we trying to get at? And it's okay to open these questions up to students and discuss and debate these things, and try to get at something that's a little more meaningful and useful societally than what we're currently getting. Because if we just continue to focus on content and test scores, it doesn't get us anything. Except, I mean, that's the problem. it's so useful. Students love getting good grades. The parents like getting good grades. School board members like high test scores. The parents and students like getting AP science credit. It helps them on their applications for college to get into more selective colleges. So it's this whole credential system, but that's all it is. The substance of it, the actual value of what they're learning isn't there.
Well, and I'm going to ask because, you know, I do very specific activity lessons. We do a history of science thing. We look at the philosophical, I do social science. We do a range. We read Henrietta Lacks and talk about who has the power and where all of those questions. The pushback I get from a lot of my very smart, very disciplined, well-studied science pre-service teachers is, I don't know any history. I don't want to know. So, I mean, it is this, their lack and, you know, and I've reflected on this quite a bit too. What did I know at 21? What did I understand about public policy at 21? And it's really hard for them to all of a sudden say, my science has less value because I've been so good at that. And now there's all these other things that I don't know. And now I'm supposed to understand history because I skipped history class because I didn't like it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the same reaction I get from my students. And that's in the last chapter of the book where I try to offer, what do we need to do differently? One of the sections is change the way we prepare science teachers and think about maybe not just worrying about their science content knowledge, although even that's becoming less of a you know, in this era of very easy certification, fly by night online, almost anybody can get certified any place, anytime to teach any subject. And so that's a fight to try to establish some kind of standards. And yeah, there's no easy answers to that, Helen. And I know exactly the kind of reactions you've gotten. But if at least the students are thinking that maybe I need something more. And I mean, way back when I taught, I decided I was going to use the history of science to teach science. And after teaching 8th grade science in Racine, Wisconsin, I thought, I don't really know that much history. And so I went to grad school and got my master's in history of science. Everyone's not going to do that. I get that. But yeah.
Thanks, Helen. Anna, would you like to ask your question out loud?
Sure. So I was just struck by one of the ideas earlier about this being like a science studies approach similar to social studies. And however, when I think about science studies, I think about the fact that when you really dive into science studies, what you come to appreciate is how much debate and contention there is about what actually makes science science and how to demarcate scientific knowledge and whether it should have a special status and how it changes over time. And so I'm wondering if this approach would entail trying to define what like a position on that we want students to take, or would it actually engage students in that meta debate about whether we can actually define science in sort of a consistent way?
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. And science studies has evolved over time. There's a nice article by Harry Collins and Robert Evans on the third wave of science studies. And this is actually an older article now, but there was the initial science studies, which was understand science because that's where truth is and what scientists do, the early science studies of the World War II period. And then the questioning pushback on the authority of science, the social construction of scientific knowledge stuff, which was science shouldn't have privileged status. And that's sort of come to an end. And now we're back to, well, what does make science? It does have some epistemic status. It does have some legitimacy different than other ways of knowing. It's the work of Helen Longino and Naomi Oreskes. And what is that? And so, engaging those kinds of questions, I think and we can't I don't think we should, with high school students, get into those kinds of deep science studies type questions. And so the sort of developmentally appropriate approach, I think, is just to, well, what is it? How do we come to know things about the world, and not get into reading Bruno Latour and things like that, who himself, before he died, recanted a lot of his earlier questions about the tearing down the special status of science, saying, no, there is a place for expertise, and scientists do have expertise that should be valued. And so sort of a simplified approach to sort of these epistemological questions is the best we can do, I think, with high school students. Is like, how do scientists collectively come to a decision? How do they know things? It's based on evidence. It's not always clear. People have to argue about it and come to a consensus. And there are historical case studies you can use to illustrate that. There are actual classroom activities students can engage in to experience that. And there are different ways that we can move toward that kind of goal.
Thanks, Anna. I think this might just be a brief point to mention. You talk about project physics a little bit in the book. Can you talk about like why we don't have project physics as a, this rich narrative case study approach to teaching science? Like, why didn't it work? Or is that
Right,
too
so
much for?
No, I mean, I don't know if I have I do have I have an answer for that. So the project physics, Harvard project physics, was a physics, sort of a history-based physics curriculum developed in the 70s in response to the NSF funded projects earlier, PSSC physics in particular. And the key people on that were Gerald Holton, who was a physicist and a historian of science at Harvard, and Jim Rutherford, who was a high school science teacher in California and came out to Cambridge to get his degree in the history of science, and latched on to this project with Holton to develop Harvard project physics. And it was this very rich cultural appreciation kind of a approach to physics, not just looking at the technical aspects of Newton's 3 laws, but like what were the questions about from Aristotle to Newton and Galileo, and very rich approach. And it was found to be successful in a lot of ways, in a lot of contexts, but didn't latch on. And part of it is, I think, that probably a lot of teachers felt like, well, I don't have a lot of background in this. This doesn't feel familiar to me. And that's why we're not going to adopt it. Or there was a status issue that, well, PSSC is for like real rigorous science, and Harvard project physics is the physics for poets kind of thing. And our school doesn't want to adopt that because, that's for kids that need a soft science approach. Interestingly, though, Jim Rutherford on that project went on, and for those of you who are familiar with this, became the head of AAAS's Project 2061. And if you look at, this is sort of the first standards project that came out of this period. 1989 was Science for All Americans was published. And Jim Rutherford was the primary author of that, along with Andrew Algren. And a lot of what you see in Project 2061 is the same kinds of things that you would see in Harvard project physics. They talk about the importance of history of science and philosophy of science and the institutional context of science. And in some ways, that comes closest to what I'm arguing for in this book. And that was eclipsed then by the National Science Education Standards in '96, and now the Next Generation Science Standards. And as we've gone along, especially with the emergence of standards and standardized assessments, we've moved further and further and further towards less about this contextual, historical, rich kind of understanding of science, towards a much more technical, content-focused, which is what we get with NGSS in particular, right? I mean, when you look at scientific practices, they talk about science and engineering practices. You know, if that's not workforce training, I don't know what is.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that answer. We're going to give the last question to Ray Bangs. Ray, would you like to ask your question on camera here?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a high school teacher and I follow the curriculum of the AP Chemistry and the AP Physics during the day, but I also have the pleasure of having a sandbox 1 hour before school starts, and that's where I play around with the ideas you advocate. But I'm just one person. How can we make more achievement in this venue of trying to make change? I'm up against administrators in our district and administrators in other districts that say, okay, fine, 1 hour before school is fine, but it's not part of the state curriculum.
Yeah. I mean, I commend you for that. That's fantastic. And a lot of folks wouldn't even do that. And that's wonderful. I think that change comes from a lot of individual actions like that, like being a voice for something different. When these things come up, so with my students in my class, you know, they'll say, well, what, you know, don't I have to just cover the standards? And I say, you know, there's nobody looking in your room to see what you're doing. And you should do what isn't educational malpractice. You should do what the kind of learning and teaching that is ideal and it meets the needs of students. And if everybody begins to do their part, this is my part to write this book, is to try to get people to think a little differently. I know that there's initiatives that I've been connected with at Stanford where they're beginning to say that we need to think about the standards NGSS 2.0, that we're losing this sort of focus on people being able to deal with science in their daily lives because of too much of a focus on just technical content. And I keep doing what I can along those lines, and all of us just, you know, that's how change happens. There's not any magic wand that anyone can wave. Just living the best way that we can and trying to realize the goals that we think are worth pursuing.
I appreciate that. Is there some more information on those initiatives that you're talking about coming out of Stanford?
Yeah, I mean, I can pass along, I don't know how to do that best. Jonathan Osborne was, there's some reports that came out from a conference that I attended last February. And Andy Zucker also has been involved in those, but there are these things. I don't know, Doug, if there's a way to get those to the SIG.
Yeah, I'll put them in the follow-up email.
Okay, that'd be great.
The Reinventing Scientific. In fact, we may have one of those authors here on the call. I don't know if you want to say anything. Okay. Maybe not. I'll include it in the follow-up email. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you for your question, Ray. And John, I want to, on behalf of the SIG and of myself, thank you so much for joining us today. I really want to encourage everybody in the SIG to check out this book. It is really a fantastic book for a group read. If you have a group of science educators and teachers that you're working with, you know, it's manageable and it divides nicely up into those 3 sections for, you know, to think about the ideas in there. And so John, I want to say thank you for being here today, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Doug, so much. And great questions. And the book is short. It's really, yeah, it's digestible, as Doug said. And it just it really hopefully raises a lot of more questions than it offers answers, but those questions are important ones, I think.
I'm going to hit stop on the record now. But thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next month, and hopefully we'll see you in Philadelphia at AERA at the Science History Institute.
Thanks much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.